Well, I don't like to go from one heavy subject to an even heavier subject, but Ukraine is in the news, and listening to that, hearing about it, I was reminded of how Judge Kozinski talked about the Second Amendment, famously calling it the Doomsday provision, referring
Yeah,
to when the government is no longer the preventer of violence, but the source of violence. Then the right of self-defense and to bear arms is all that you have left, and that's why it's a natural right. And I wondered, Jeff, did you want to
yeah.
chime in on that?
Well, you two are seeped in Second Amendment cases, and I'm not. I stop at the First Amendment, right? That's where my practice starts and ends. But so I went. I never heard of this provision, the Doomsday provision, or this case. So I went back and I read it, and I think maybe our listeners might be interested to see what Kaczynski said in light of what's happening in Ukraine and everything else. He said the Second Amendment is a doomsday provision, one designed for those exceptionally rare circumstances where all other rights have failed, where the government refuses to stand for re-election and silences those who protest, where courts have lost the courage to oppose or can find no one to enforce their decrees. However improbable those contingencies may seem today, facing them unprepared is a mistake a free people get to make only once. That was a fascinating quote by Kaczynski. I appreciate you guys bringing my attention to it.
Yeah, I thought that was a terrific opener. I wondered, Sean, what are your thoughts about the importance of the Second Amendment in the U.S., but what I would call, and I think Kaczynski believed, was a natural right of self-defense and to bear arms against aggression, even when you have an otherwise civilized government, they can often fail, as we've seen in our own country, and as we're witnessing now in Ukraine and Russia. Wonder if you thought that's going to affect the discussion on gun rights in the United States.
Yeah, I doubt it. I mean, obviously, I agree with Judge Kaczynski, but I think both those who are pro Second Amendment kind of already understand that view, and those who are opposed don't will say that that's something foreign, right? Our neighbors are Canada and Mexico. What are the chances of that ever happening? We don't live in that neighborhood, and so it's different. Of course, Kaczynski's view, which we all share, is that it's a natural human right, regardless of whether you live in Ukraine or Botswana or the United States or Cambodia, whatever, you have that right. And so, I just think people are too sort of tied up in their own bubble to realize the universal application of that doctrine. And so I unfortunately doubt it will change the discussion, at least with maybe a few, and it might give those of us who are of that persuasion one more arrow in our quiver to shoot, but it's probably going to miss its mark.
You got right to the nub of why I think Judge Kaczynski's formulation there, while eloquent and powerful, I don't think that's the best argument for the natural right of self-defense. I think the best argument is based on incidents we've seen in our own country, such as in 2005 after Hurricane Katrina. I recall NPR had an article about there were reports of roaming marauders in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, people just looking to go and violently rob people of what few possessions they had left. And people realized they needed to be ready to defend themselves. And so there was a spike in gun ownership after Hurricane Katrina, and people were reminded that hopefully not very often, but from time to time, you can expect that the thin mask of civilization may slip, and you need to be prepared for that eventuality.
Well, speaking of masks, I mean, more recently, the past 2 years have seen the record gun ownership and purchasing in light of COVID and the summer of love, as they called it, with all the BLM and Antifa rioting. I mean, there were, I think, 2020, was it 2020 or 2021? I think it was 2020 was the record for most firearm purchases, and 2021 was not too far behind. And so I think people have seen how, while thankfully it didn't really happen, I remember the early days of the pandemic and being like, anything could happen right now. You don't know how people will react and when they're desperate until they do it. And fortunately, it never really got to that point. But there were a lot of people who were seeing stuff on fire on their TVs and seeing people act, whatever side you are on the COVID thing, acting differently than you, and seeing you as the enemy or doing things wrongly. And so, yeah, I think people got a wake up call back to reality. We've been so spoiled as Americans to have no concept of anything close to what Ukrainians are going through, or people just normal, in other countries where, we don't understand the level of criminality where people just can't even protect themselves. You see it in Mexico with, against cartel, these people who arm themselves because they're literally chattel to these people, to these gangs. And we fortunately have at least somewhat the rule of law in the United States that doesn't allow that on like a systematic basis. So yeah, I think we're clueless to that.